Welcome. My name is Gerald Newman, and I'm the director of the Human Rights Program here at Harvard Law School. As you know, we are living through a difficult period for human beings and their human rights. The COVID-19 pandemic is not yet over. The modern international order is under attack, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine has also resulted in shortages of food and increased worldwide inflation. Democracy is threatened in many countries, including the United States. The African region has suffered the consequences of these major dislocations with particular force, even if the attention of Western media has often been focused elsewhere. That includes the threats to democracy, either within electoral systems or by means of military coups. At the same time, human rights advocates and institutions in Africa have been innovating ways of strengthening democracy. These are issues that we want to explore today, and with an extraordinary panel of experts. The panel will be led by the Human Rights Program's Associate Director, Dr. Abadir Ibrahim. Before joining us at HRP, he was the head of the Secretariat for the Legal and Justice Affairs Advisory Council of Ethiopia, an institution established as an independent body to advise the government on conducting pro-democracy and pro-rights justice sector reforms. As a lawyer, activist, scholar, and educator in African human rights law, he both practices and studies human rights at a global, African, and domestic level. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, the HLS Program on Law and Society in the Muslim World, the Harvard University Center for African Studies, and the Harvard African Law Association. So thank you, and please take the word about here.
Thank you, Professor Newman. Good morning, everyone. I suppose I should say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those joining us from different parts of the world. Let me quickly go through a number of items, administrative items first. This event is recorded, and this recording will be made available to participants and online after this event, within a couple of days after this event. We have put up on the messaging board link to our mailing list, and those of you who want to follow announcements of future events, you can sign up to the mailing list there. I would also thank the co-sponsors of today's event again, the Program of Law and Society in the Muslim World, Harvard University Center for African Studies, and the Harvard African Law Association. Our panelists today are really interesting individuals and scholars. Ibrahim Akane is the head of the African Union Advocacy Program at Open Society Initiatives for Western Africa. He is a licensed attorney in Senegal and France, and he is an attorney that practices within the African system. I'll say one of the prominent attorneys who practices in front of the African system of human rights. And he is also a scholar who publishes both academic and advocacy publications. Dr. Samir Yusuf is the head of the Ethiopian project at the Institute of Security Studies. He is a leading scholar of comparative politics within the context of Ethiopia especially. And his work in the last couple of years has been seeping out from the realm of academia into the public sphere, and many consider him to be a leading public academic, public scholar in Ethiopia. Dr. Lana Salman is a fellow at the Middle East Initiative at the Belfer Center of International Affairs at Harvard University, and she's also a fellow at Ghent University. And I've had the pleasure of reading her work, as well as Dr. Samir's work. And I've had the pleasure of reading her articles and policy publications, which are really instructive, especially to me, because they show me the blind spots within my own research agenda. Let me first start by introducing participants to the big picture of trends within Africa, which we will be following up on in detail today. The modern African states, or the history of the modern African states, starts with the end of colonialism and with democratization, a process of democratization that starts from the 50s, mid 50s to the 70s. And then you have the Cold War, basically, which brings down the number of democracies in Africa, and the number of coup d'etats rises during the Cold War in Africa, and authoritarianism becomes the norm. And this process goes on until the 90s, I would say, from the early to mid 90s, where you have the end of the Cold War and a period that is called the period of constitutional revival and democratization, where a process that brings 2/3 of African countries to either be free or partly free by the definitions of Freedom House. And this process brings a phase of stability where you have the OAU that transforms into the African Union, which has its own implications on the regional level, and the institutional, the security, and human rights infrastructure of Africa changes starting in the 90s. And some argue that a fourth wave of democratization comes to Africa together with the Arab Spring. It's starting in Tunisia and Egypt, and some argue that there's an African Spring that follows from that. But I will say it's not clear whether that process is the fourth spring or it's a counter wave of authoritarianism that follows from the third wave that started in the 90s. Three of our panelists today will be covering Ethiopia, Western Africa, and Tunisia. And let's start with Samir. Samir, Ethiopia is one of those countries that went through all, the second wave and the third wave of global democratization. And the second wave comes in the 70s to Ethiopia. But that was a missed opportunity. And then once again, after about 20 years of authoritarian military rule, you have the third wave come to Ethiopia in the 90s, where Ethiopia adopts a democratic constitution, starts having elections, but that was a missed opportunity as well. And some would argue that the transition that comes in 2018, which you could see as part of the fourth wave under quotations, which looks like to be faltering or failing, depending on who you ask. So with all these opportunities, why has Ethiopia failed to democratize, and why does authoritarianism persist?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bader. Thank you for the organizers in general. This is a very important topic to discuss, I guess. And I'll try to address that question in my presentation. And to make it easy for the participants to follow my presentation, I'll be sharing my PowerPoint here. I don't know if you can see it.
We were able to see it, Samir.
Okay.
And yes, now we can see it.
Thank you. So I'll be talking on Ethiopia's democratic predicaments. And I'll specifically emphasize state-society dynamics and balance of power between state agents and social forces. So my starting point will be, so this is, let me do it once again, if you don't mind. Yes. So my starting point will be the fact that Ethiopia has had several types of regimes over the last couple of decades. They differed in terms of their worldview, political ideology, philosophy, programs and policies, and so on and so forth. But one thing has been a constant in modern Ethiopian history. That's the persistence of autocratic rule. So before 1974, we had a monarchic form of government in Ethiopia, which was replaced by a military dictatorship in 1974. And that went on until 1991, when a coalition, a hierarchically organized coalition of ethnic groups, basically captured state power and ruled Ethiopia until 2018 with a pristine form of what we call electoral authoritarianism in the literature. And in 2018, there was a significant level of political liberalization in the country. Ethiopia was a pretty much hope-giving state in terms of democratization efforts. But then with the lapse of time, what we have actually witnessed is the relapse of the country into what seems to be a competitive authoritarian state. So competitive authoritarianism is in the literature defined as very roughly, a system where you have an elaborate facade of democratic institutions and democratic competition, but the regime is autocratic to the core. So if you see several indicators such as elections and human rights protection and the status of judicial autonomy and media freedom, there are significant setbacks, significant backtracking in terms of protecting significant space for the flourishing of all these very important tenets of democratization. So the question then is, what explains the persistence of authoritarianism? And there could be several explanations for this. You can focus on different aspects of politics and economics and international politics and so on and so forth. But today I'll be emphasizing a very fundamental factor, a more structural analysis to understand the foundations of authoritarian resilience in this country. And I'll be developing the general argument that authoritarian persistence has a lot to do, of course, in Ethiopia, with the balance of power or the imbalance of power between state and social forces and the nature of their interaction. So two things matter here. On the one hand, the power asymmetry between state agents and social forces, matters a lot. But on the other hand, the nature of interaction between social forces and state agents also matters a lot. So a combination of those two sets of factors partly explains the fundamentals of autocratic persistence in Ethiopia. And this is divided into four sub-arguments, and I will be touching upon each one of them in the course of my presentation. The first sub-argument I'll be developing is about the origins of autocracy in modern Ethiopia. And it goes like this. So the modern Ethiopian state grew hegemonic during its expansion, and specifically the Menelik expansion of the 19th century. And in the process, it's managed to overpower its non-state contenders and thereby established the foundations of a persistent authoritarian rule in the post-imperial period. And then the second sub-argument will be that once established, this power asymmetry between social and state forces has been successively enhanced as a result of political stability. So political stability, when and where it exists inside Ethiopia, has really helped autocratic governments, autocratic regimes, to enhance their autocratic grip over society and further weaken the organizational power of social forces. And then the third sub-argument I'll be developing is that, if political stability, abets autocracy, then a logical route towards democracy might seem to be resisting the power of the state. But in Ethiopian recent history, neither mild opposition to state rule nor severe form of resistance to state rule have contributed to democratization. So mild opposition to state rule in the form of protest movements has not really helped in the consolidation of democracy in Ethiopia. I will come to the explanation later on. But severe form of resistance to state rule in the form of, armed insurrection has ended up actually in deepening autocracy in the country. So let me try to develop each one of these arguments turn by turn. So let's start with the social origins of authoritarianism in modern Ethiopia. So here I will borrow from Charles Stilly, a noted political sociologist who, focusing on Western Europe, linked democratization with state expansion. So according to Charles Stilly, state expansion led to two very important political outcomes in historic Europe. On the one hand, it's contributed to the bureaucratization and institutionalization of the state. And of course, it also helped the growing coercive formidability of the European state. But on the other hand, he also argued that state expansion helped in democratization efforts as well. And this is because at the time when the state was expanding, it had to negotiate with a very important, non-state contender in historic Europe, and that is the emerging bourgeois class. Because it was in need, the state was in need of a constant flow of, funds to finance its war project. And through that negotiation between the two very important actors, the state and the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois class also got a very important concession from the state in the form of the protection of private property. So according to Charles Stilly, the protection of private property then laid the foundation for a gradual emergence of democracy as a form of rule in Western Europe. Now, there is a very interesting parallel to draw here between historic Europe and historic Ethiopia, but of course, with a very significant differences as well. So on the one hand, just like in Europe, Ethiopia's state has, expanded over centuries. And in the process, it grew, formidable in terms of its coercive power. It also went on becoming more and more institutionalized and bureaucratized. But on the other hand, that state expansion, the process of state expansion in historic Ethiopia did not contribute to democratization. And that is because of the absence in historic Ethiopia of an important contender to state power. The bourgeois class was virtually non-existent in Ethiopia. The aristocracy was weak compared to the aristocracy in feudal Europe, and other social forces like the CSOs and the like were hopelessly weak in imperial Ethiopia as well. Now that created a favorable political climate for the emergence of the state as the sole power in Ethiopia's political spectrum. And that really helped the state to lay the foundation for an absolutist autocratic state in post-imperial Ethiopia as well. Now, this takes me to another very important point. So once power asymmetry has been established or was established between state and social forces, what actually enhances it in successive eras, during successive regimes in the country? So one very important factor that enhanced autocracy in Ethiopia after 1974, after the downfall of the imperial dynasty, is or has been political stability. So of course, autocracy also helps to bring about political stability. But the one I'm focusing on now is how political stability helps in the enhancement of authoritarianism as well. So successive regimes in Ethiopia have really capitalized on different times and zones of stability to enhance their autocratic grip over society. And this is by doing four specific things. One is they have established more dense and domineering institutional connections with society. And both the DERG and the EPRDF have used party structures for that specific purpose of establishing closer presence and connections with different sections of the population in Ethiopia. And two, once that connection is established through different party networks, then they also have co-opted groups and individuals into state structures as well. During the DERG's period, the WPE, Workers' Party of Ethiopia, played a very important role in this regard, but this co-option has been taken to a whole new level during the EPRDF's period, when the EPRDF networks and structures were effectively used for that very purpose. And by 2010, the EPRDF boasted of having close to 5 million members. And then the Prosperity Party now boasts of having more than 11 million members as well. And the third very important thing regimes have done over decades to enhance their grip over society is to cultivate dependence and obedience on the part of individuals and organizations, dependent to their party structures, to their party ideologies, and obedience to their policy directives as well. So anyone that falls outside the party structure is actually captured by other organizations that are somehow controlled by party institutions. So a wave of youth associations, women's associations, professional associations were either created or hijacked by successive regimes to cultivate this dependence of or obedience of citizens and organizations in the country. And finally, if co-option doesn't work, repression is the answer, right? So if some dissident voices are heard anywhere in the country or within the state system or within the party structure, then the party or the regime would be quite quick to harass, arrest, and eliminate these voices. So these four mechanisms have really helped to enhance autocratic stability, autocratic grip over society over the last decades. And then another very important point to note that is, if political stability abets autocracy, then how about resisting state authority, state hegemony? And we have had several cases of resistance against state hegemony in our recent history. And the milder form of resistance to state hegemonic aspiration is protest movements. We have had a couple of them in Ethiopia, and a few of them have been quite consequential in the sense of contributing to regime change. But unfortunately, protest movements in Ethiopia have not helped in consolidating democracy. And this is because of three major reasons. One, in the aftermath of protest movements, the Ethiopian state usually gets weakened. The party structure gets weakened, internally divided, and the command and control gets broken down. And that leads to a very brittle state and party structures, which would impede an ordered and coordinated political transition, even when there is will at the top. So many autocrats at the lower echelons of governance would sabotage democratic transition at their own, different levels. And a sum total of that being undercutting the possibility of overall democratic transition in the country. The second very important reason why protest movements have not so far contributed to democratic consolidation is the fact that in the aftermath, again, of protest movements, the state, in some form of crisis, would fail to uphold the rule of law and protect the lives of civilians from other violent actors. And this has been quite glaring over the last 4 years in Ethiopia, whereby thousands of civilians have fallen victims by several armed groups, abused their rights and killed many of them and so forth. And the state, especially the security apparatus, was quite unable or unwilling to protect these civilians from impending violence. The third very important factor then is, even in the state of crisis, even when it's weak, the state always has an edge over society. So with the lapse of time, the state recuperates and regroups and instrumentalizes its power to dominate society once again. And autocratic relapse, is simply quite a real thing. It gets quite a real thing in Ethiopia as well. So, and we have seen that several times in 1974, in 2018, in the aftermath of these protest movements. The state or the party structure gets quite weak, but then it kind of recuperates its power and reestablishes its domineering position over society. And therefore, protest movements have had minimal contribution in the process of consolidating democracy, even if they have contributed to regime change in history. And then finally, how about insurgency? The most effective way of shaking the foundation of a regime in Ethiopia, but perhaps in many other countries in the world. Perhaps ironically, the most effective way of resisting state power is also the most effective way of deepening autocracy in Ethiopia. And this is because of three very important reasons. One, war eliminates the foundations for establishing democracy, such as the economic foundations of establishing democracy. It also eliminates, several centers of independent power, such as opposition movements and the middle class. Even marketplaces wouldn't be spared in the course of war, as we have seen during the Derg's period and as we are witnessing now over the last 2 years. And this would make establishing democracy at a later stage a pretty much daunting task for all Ethiopians. The second very important reason why insurgency actually ends up deepening autocracy is that the civil war that comes out of insurgency and resistance to state creates justifications for state violation of human rights. When you are in a state of civil war, nationalism reaches its peak. And every single individual is expected to fall in line with the state narrative. And any critical thinking and dissent would be severely punished, again, as we have witnessed over the last 4 years in Ethiopia. And as many Ethiopians know quite well during the Derg's, the military junta's period between 1974 as well. And the third very important factor, and the final one, would be that war also contributes to the building of a cohesive and militaristic rebel group that would transfer its authoritarian culture and practice onto the state system when and if it captures state power. And we have seen this very well in 1991, when the TPLF, after defeating the Derg, captured state power and simply transferred its authoritarian tradition and way of dealing with its opponents onto the state system. And that contributed to authoritarian durability in Ethiopia. Let me summarize the predicaments finally. Number one, Ethiopia is quite unique by African standards in that it has a very proud, continued tradition of statehood. Unlike many African countries that have post-colonial, ancestry. But however, in Ethiopia, this continued tradition of statehood comes along with continued tradition of autocracy as well. So it has this big advantage of, rooting autocracy in our culture of statehood. And precisely because of that culture and tradition of authoritarianism, the state has had this problem of entertaining inherent instability. So continued tradition of statehood does not come along with political stability. It actually comes with, indirectly through entrenched autocracy, it comes along with inherent instability as well. However, and this is quite interesting, those forces that contribute towards inherent instability have not so far contributed to democratization in the country. Protest movements have not contributed to democratic consolidation in Ethiopia, mainly because of their comparative powerlessness, in the face of a very strong, domineering, hegemonic state. And then insurgency as a very effective way of challenging state hegemony and statehood in Ethiopia has also not contributed to democratization. It has actually contributed to the entrenchment of democracy in Ethiopia for the reasons I mentioned in my presentation. And then finally, if resistance to state rule is bad or has not contributed to democratization, can political stability contribute to democracy? As our recent history tells us, that's not the case either. When regimes get a stable political environment to flourish, they usually would like to exercise a more enhanced grip, authoritarian grip over society as well. And therefore, the predicament of democratization in Ethiopia has a lot to do with these structural forces. Of course, party institutions matter and culture matters and elites do matter, but we have to go beyond all these factors and focus more on the structural roots of authoritarianism in Ethiopia. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll stop.
Thank you, Samir. That was so interesting and enlightening. Now let me move it over to Ibrahima. Ibrahima, so between the year 2000 and 2020, there have been less than one coup d'etats in Africa on average, or should I say successful coup d'etats in Africa. And last year we had 4 successful coups and 2 attempted coups, and all but one of them, i.e. the one in Sudan, seem to be concentrated in Western Africa. This year we had 2 coups d'etats in Burkina Faso already. What is at the root of these new developments? Is this something we should be worried about? And this is something that we should expect to happen more? Or is this a fluke? So what is going on at the root of these new developments?
Thank you, Abadir. Thank you for inviting me to this very, very interesting conversation on democracy, rule of law in Africa. And I really want to start by saying, you said less coup happened between 2000 and 2020. I will just nuance what you have said, because since the creation of the African Union, 20 coups have happened in Africa. And out of those 20 coups, 12 happened in West Africa. In fact, West Africa is the region of the continent that has the biggest number of coups. since 1951, when the first coup d'etat happened in Africa, and it happened in Egypt, led by Nasser, General Nasser, and his military colleagues. Let me also give you this explanation. We tell you why it spread in West Africa. Out of the 15 countries that compose the Economic Community of West African States, only one never experienced coup d'etat, namely Senegal. The champions in coup in West Africa are Burkina Faso, I think up to 8, Nigeria, and Benin, who was before Dahomey. And those, it tells you about really the practice of coup in those countries. And a country like Guinea-Bissau, the last 3 presidents in Guinea-Bissau never ended their term. They were all taken out by a military coup. So it tells you about the prevalence of this coup system. Why? I think there are 3 main reasons. We can put it internal reason, regional reason, and the influence of external actors to the continent. Internal reason, I think the first that we need to really mention is the fact that all the West African states in the 60s inherited of a specific type of state from the colonial masters. And mostly none of them changed the nature of that colonial state in terms of action, in terms of structures, and in terms of philosophy. And that's explained why, just to add to what Samir was just saying, the authoritarianism is really embedded in the African state because none of them really didn't transform the state that they inherited with the colonial masters. And at the same time, when we get into independence, there was a lot of promises of the end of discrimination, promises of more liberty, respect for human rights, and promises of democracy and rule of law. None of these promises were met. And even in many situations, the situation was worsened by the practice of the leaders. Don't forget that 12 of the 50 countries that are under what they call less developed countries are in West Africa. So this tells you about the situation of all these countries and that kind of. And the states also that we inherited, I need to really add that important element, was a state where not only you had autocratic practices, but also where discrimination was at the heart of the structure of the society. You have lower class, from Mauritania up to Sudan, in the whole Sahel region, the majority of the population were discriminated against based on descent and also based on work. In other words, you had many traditional slaves, and slavery is still in practice in almost all those countries. And that explains now why you have all these insurgencies, because people have found other ways by using the small arms that are circulating in the region to start attacking the state on the basis of the way the state discriminates them. So the state itself is a problem. And the state is also a problem because the institutions that were created by that state, the executive, the judiciary, the parliament, none of them really delivered on the promises that we made. And sometimes they didn't deliver not because they are unwilling, but they didn't deliver because they were unable to deliver. Just to give you one example, in Senegal, up to now, in the judiciary, you have 600 judges for a population of 18 million, where according to the state itself, you need to triple that number to meet the state capacity to deliver on a judicial matter. The whole country doesn't have more than 500 lawyers. What can we say about justice in that particular context? And those who are not able to get that justice system delivering, they will find other ways of attacking the state, of trying to find their issues sorted out. So the state in general is one of the problems. The second aspect is also, again, in the internal matter, is the bad governance, corruption, and also the fact that, in the 60s, state decided not to open up democratic procedures because they wanted to unify the society, they wanted to create a nation and other stuff. But those led to the creation of one-party system, the domination of one ethnic groups and other. And in the 90s, when the Berlin Wall failed, there was a decision of many African states to open up their society, to democratize their society. But you democratize a society with the tools that really help to get to that democratization. And we didn't have those tools. Political parties in many of African countries is either a one-man system or an entity created to allow one person to access power and to use power for his benefit, his family benefit, or the people surrounded him. So the political party system is not really also helping in democratization. We also, the National Assembly are not helping, even sometimes if there are many members coming from the opposition, they always serve one ruling party, they always serve the leader of the country. So, and in Mali, when in the late 90s, the APRM did its evaluation of democracy in Mali, they concluded that Mali had a fake democracy, that everything that we are seeing in Mali, you can have the institution, you have all the external aspects that show democracy, but when you look at the inside, it's not functioning. So the fake democracy that existed also helped to really make this situation worse. And those elements led to coup, led to military coup, because the justification always of the military coup was bad governance, was corruption, was the control of the state by a minority that uses state assets for themselves rather than delivering on particular issue. And very interestingly, when the military came to power, because they were unable to run a country, to run a state, they also completely ended up doing the same thing, getting into bad governance, getting into corruption, trying to civilize, a military system, which is really a way of controlling the state resources, controlling the state assets, and doing the same that civilians were doing. So those elements are really very important. The second element that I would like to add here is what I can call the role of external actors. I will talk about external actors before regional actors, and I will explain why. In the 60s, in some of the countries, like in Mali, like in Upper Volta, which became Burkina Faso. In few countries, there were attempts to transform the state that we inherited from the colonial power. But every time there was this attempt to change the state, external actors, particularly former colonial masters, always organized coup to maintain the status quo. And they were using always the army because they trained the military, they had those connections with the military, and they were using the military to get. So, and that contributed also to reinforce, you know, to reinforce the weaknesses of the state in Africa. And the third that I can really also mention is the regional mechanism. In West Africa, we have the Economic Community of West Africa, and we have the African Union. The reason I'm mentioning all of this is because of the prevalence of coup in Africa. In 1999, the African state, under the Organization of the African Unity, decided to start tackling the issue of coup in Africa by making a decision during the summit in Algiers on what they call unconstitutional change of government. So everywhere a coup happened, the country is suspended and the country cannot participate in any activities of the OAU, and the country is obliged under the leadership of OAU to really organize the transition to civil system. That was done in 1999. In 2003, when the OAU came into force, it was reiterated. And in 2007, when African countries adopted the African Charter on Democracy, Election, and Governance, it was reiterated. It was really now put in a treaty that is now in force. Unfortunately, there was a kind of practices in Africa where if you are powerful, you are treated in a certain way. If you are not a powerful country, you are also treated in a certain way. So meaning that the practices of the regional and continental body really didn't help to really deal with the issues and to try to deal with the resurgence of coup and trying to fix the problem created by the coup and to try to avoid their repetition. And ECOWAS, in that regard, was a very interesting experience. And I would like to, the last minute that I have to explain how it is complicated and how the system that we have today is a very complicated system and that can lead to another worse mechanism that really put Africa at the moment in a kind of complex situation where you want to sort out a problem, but in practice, you cannot do it. In West Africa, in 2001, they decided to adopt a protocol on good governance, which has provision on how to deal with different coups on the region. And to be able to do that, they decided that they have a convergent constitutional principle that all the 15 West Africans have to adopt to ensure that the civilian will continue to run the country and the role of the military is to protect the country rather than run the country. But when the coup happened, they also decided that through that process, they will put in place a mechanism of sanction with 3 levels of sanction. One is suspension. Second is targeted sanction against those who organize the coup. And the third is economic sanction against the state to ensure that this coup is not repeated and the military will always give the power to the civilian. When we look at the recent coup that happened in the region, and we realize that this system cannot be applied, you know, to that reality. What is the reality of West Africa today? is the state that I mentioned to you is collapsing. The society is imploding. You know, in countries like Mali, in countries like Burkina Faso, in countries like Niger, those people in the lower class that I mentioned earlier are the ones taking arms against their own state, of course, using sometimes the peculiar context of North and the Sahara region, where you have terrorist group that are also associated with Islam. And they are using those kind of, because it's an opportunity for them to use those groups to really weaken the state. And in that particular context where the state is weak, taking action against a weak state can lead to something that is even worse than the situation that is happening. And that's what we are experiencing. Recently, because Mali had 2 coups d'etat, ECOWAS went to decide to even use economic sanctions against Mali. And those economic sanctions against Mali were seen not a sanction against the military who organized the coup, but it was seen as sanction against the population who not only were very poor, very weak, and now economic sanction will make them very poor again. So leading to a kind of contestation of ECOWAS as a regional institution that was trying to help to sort out the problem. So again, here, the problem of the coup is where the military are using the state to really maintain themselves into power, and the regional institution trying to say that we need to allow civilians to continue to run the country, where those civilians and those military were all involved in the bad governance, in the corruption, and contributed to make the democratic system that we have in our region as a fake democracy. So we are just turning around. And this is why, at the moment, actions that are really undertaken at the regional level are trying to find a way of really revising the totality of the mechanism that they put in place. But lastly, and there is a new trend in the region, which can be really assimilated also to a form of coup d'etat, which is the attempt by leaders who are in power, who were supposed to hand over the power, but who changed the constitution to continue to maintain themselves into power. That is the question we call here in the region, the third term question. ECOWAS is attempting to end that process, to end, that practice of leaders trying to change their constitution, but is facing a lot of resistance from a number of states that are really trying to continue to control the state. So when you look at all of this, what are we realizing? We are realizing that the state up to now has not helped to really implement the promises of the independence. We are still running around. We are still trying to find our way. And in that particular context, given the fact that now most of the countries are on the verge of collapsing because of the internal crisis, the whole region is at a risk of collapsing, just because of its incapacity of dealing with the reason that led to these different coups. And this is where we are at the moment. And I think if we really want to solve, to deal with the human rights violation, to deal with democratic issues, to deal with bad governance, to deal with corruption, we need to rethink the state. We need to really find a way of creating a state that is able to really not only transform the country, but also help the countries to deal with all these problems and to start thinking of the development of the region, the development of the different countries, and then promoting rule of law, respecting democracy, and respecting human rights. And that's not given. It's not even sure that we are getting into there. There is a lot of work to be done, again, in West Africa to ensure that rule of law and respect for human rights are really defended, are really protected in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahima. Ibrahima said a couple of interesting things that go into Dr. Salman's approach. But before I hand it over to you, let me quickly say to the participants that although we will open up the questions and answer session after Dr. Lana Salman's presentation, you can start putting in your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom even earlier, and that will help us, organize the questions better. So if you have any questions, you can throw them in the Q&A function. Ibrahima said that the fact that you have the institutions of parliament and elections and so on doesn't mean that you have democracy. But in the end of September, the African Court on Human and People's Rights passed a decision which found that President Kais Saied's decrees suspending parliament have violated the right of the people to participate in the conduct of public affairs, and has ordered Tunisia to repeal these decrees and return to constitutional democracy within 2 years. So if in 2 years, the things that the African Court asked Tunisia to do are achieved, does that mean we have achieved democracy in Tunisia? You're on mute.
Yeah. Thank you for this provocation, Abadir, and thank you for having me here today. So before I elaborate on this question, let me give a quick background here to help the audience situate my answer in a broader context. So as you know, Tunisia has earned this by now cliche reputation of being, the only hope of the 2011 Arab uprisings, the only place where democracy has seen somewhat of a life and there has been a democratic transition. But now there's a period of, quote, backsliding. So before going to the now, in reality, this past decade has been extremely bumpy in Tunisia. And for someone who has been looking more closely, the prospect wouldn't have been so hopeful, right? So there have been really fundamental confrontation and near breaking points in 2013, 2015, about fundamental issues that have to do with personal freedoms, with the role of Sharia in governing Tunisians' lives, with women's rights, etc. And there were political assassinations in 2013 of leftist politicians, Shukri Belaid and then Mohamed Brahmi, with a lot of rage against these assassinations, and of course nothing done to know who assassinated them, to do justice. And in July 2013, because of these crises, after these political assassinations, the National Quartet were put in place to broker a national conversation, national dialogue to bring the stalemate to an end. And the National Quartet had the Union of Lawyers, the Human Rights League, the Union of Tunisian Workers, the UGTT, and the Union of Handicrafts, UTICA. And this quartet won the Nobel Prize in 2014 precisely for brokering a democratic arrangement, etc. This is for the international community, right? But scholars such as Nadia Marzouki have pointed out that from 2014 onwards, there's been something that she calls a rotten compromise. So actually things had gotten to a standstill with, by showing that neither the secular leaders at that time, Beji Qaid Sibsi and Nida Tunis, nor the Islamists with Rashid al-Ghanouchi and Ennahda had garnered enough popular support to make any meaningful political change and deliver on the promises of the revolution. Hence the idea of rotten compromise and the complete deadlock. So instead, in the decade after revolution, I think, I stopped counting at some point, but Tunisia had 9 separate governments come and go, come to power and leave. And the longest of which has lasted 2.5 years, maybe at most. So in 2019, when Qais Said came to power, he promised to bring quote unquote justice. Like some people here on this call, on this Zoom meeting, he's also a lawyer, and so justice is something that he speaks about a lot, and he has actually made a lot of effort to judicialize politics. He ran on a program of anti-representative democracy. Like he basically told people straightforward that democracy brought very little improvements to people's lives, according to him. It only deepened corruption, and it brought an ineffectual parliament where people were bickering all day long and doing nothing for Tunisians, right? So he was elected in 2019 based on this program. But in 2014 already, when I was in Tunisia, interviewing a group of activists from the Manishin Sameh campaign, which was Manishin Sameh means I do not forgive. This was a blanket amnesty law to forgive wrongdoings of the administration under authoritarian rule that engaged in wrongdoing. And despite a lot of public pressure not to grant this amnesty, not to grant this forgiveness, not to do this, not to let it pass, it did pass. So there were very many violations with that to Tunisia's transitional justice process. Anyway, in that time, I was interviewing one of these young activists, and he told me the following. We wrote this in a Medip article, in an article in the Middle East Research Initiative report. And I'm going to quote him here. This is 2014, okay? And this is what he told me. I simply do not believe in politics that is party politics. I adopt a vision that Qais Said, who was not so well known on the scene yet in 2014, discussed in terms of inverting the hourglass of politics, meaning a bottom-up approach to gaining power. This vision translates into a different type of election, not top-down elections of the type we have witnessed so far. Rather, it consists of forming local councils, out of which are formed regional councils, and from those national councils. And this vision calls for simultaneous reorganization and redistribution of political and administrative power. And then he told me, I believe and adhere to a pyramidal structure of power that does not require you to join a party. It asks that you focus on your neighborhood. The election law that would support such an organization of power would rest on the basis of representation at the smallest possible scale, not on the basis of electoral lists of political parties. So we no longer vote based on partisan politics, but actually based on the integrity of particular people who are your neighbors. Your neighbor can't possibly promise that he will create 500 new jobs. If you had a new local government law that prioritized local representation over the national parties, you could prevent all this chicanery and all these false promises. So already in 2014, that was the idea about Qais Said. So, unlike many politicians, Qais Said was, for lack of better terms, consequential, right? He promised to upend representative democracy, garnered support because of that program, if we may really call it a program, and got elected based on that. So his suspension of parliament in July 25, 2021, and later his dismantling of this institution, which is still dismantled, is something that he said he would do. And maybe people did not take him seriously, but he did what he promised to do. Now, I want to make clear that I am no supporter of Qais Said. This is not a position of support at all. And furthermore, I want to suggest that asking whether or not Tunisia is now back to authoritarian regime or not, and whether some institutional changes will bring it back to democracy, is not the right question. Instead, we should ask, how have Tunisians, especially poor Tunisians, experienced political changes in the past 10 years, and what has that done to their understanding and idea of politics and politicization and democracy? So instead of looking at procedural dimensions and institutions like parliaments as the sites of democratic politics, I suggest looking at people's everyday lives instead. So, and I want to provide two clarifications here, especially, poor people's everyday lives. So I want to provide two clarifications here. One is, why should we look at the lives of the poorest Tunisians? Simply because if we make sure that the poorest, say the rural illiterate agriculture female worker in the, God knows, I don't know what corner of the Qarwan rural, Qarwan is one of the poorest governorates in Tunisia. So that rural woman who's an agricultural worker in Qarwan, if we make sure that she is protected and has her rights, and everybody above her will have their rights. So that's the justification for looking at the poorest of the poor and whether they are protected or not. And the second thing is that a focus on everyday life is not about focusing on ephemeral, the work of those weird anthropologists or ethnographers thing. Focusing on the everyday does not ally the workings of political institutional apparatuses, official institutional apparatuses. So it would be too narrow, for example, to say that the everyday is ephemeral and is actually separate from the macro distributions of power. In fact, state capacity and the ability to deliver justice are structured through everyday state institutions. And it's through these micro imbrications with power that people become political and form ideas about their situation and their outlook about what's going on around them. So let me give three quick examples of things that have not changed post Qais Said's July 2015 coming to power. And they all have to do with the integrity of people's bodies, something, more than in everydayness, something intimate, something that we all relate to. So first is the unequal distribution of toxicity, by which I mean Tunisia has huge environmental problems that happen to affect mostly the poorest of the poor. From toxicity because of phosphate extraction in Gebes, and water pollution and cancer rates that are inexplicable in these areas, from uncontrolled landfills for toxic waste that ends up being either in popular neighborhoods or in locations where there are industries that are capitalizing on poor people's labor by employing poor people and almost bribing them to accept jobs that actually kill them instead of being jobless. So all this is about the unequal distribution of toxicity, where the poorest of the poor suffer from from polluted environments, from extra burden of disease, from cancer, from debilitating sicknesses, so that others can prosper because someone else is producing the garbage somewhere, someone else is profiting from the extraction of phosphate somewhere, right? And those are not paying, these people are not paying the prices, and there's no equal distribution of costs. The second thing is when these people who are subjected to, for example, environmental degradation, or, as people have told me when I did research about this, the killing of their friends and kin and family and the maiming of their children, when they do object to this, their mobilization is criminalized. So there's like a trend of criminalizing popular movements in Tunisia. And let me point out that this has been happening before Qais Said. So governments before Qais Said have criminalized social movements, sending police to brutally repress protesters. And after Qais Said, they have done this. And before Qais Said, activists who spoke out were persecuted in different ways by the government. And after he came, it's the same thing. So nothing has really changed, but there seems to be, even in the national media, a talk about, Qais Said is going back to authoritarian, it's going back to repressive mechanisms of freedom of protesting and freedom. But this has been happening before he came to power. But those other governments were institutionally more democratic. And so they were not called violations of people's freedoms. And the last thing is the utter and utmost neglect of life. Like as we speak now, the UGTT, the Tunisian Tunisian labor movement has organized a strike in Zardis, which is a southern coastal city, because an boat that had been carrying Tunisian migrants to Europe drowned. But this time around, it drowned very quickly. And the coastal guards who collected the coastal guards did not collect they were careless. Basically, they didn't collect the bodies. And so fishermen had to go into sea to collect these bodies. And people don't know, families do not know where their lost ones are buried, if they're buried or not, if they have been collected or not. There's a report, there were newborns on that boat. Okay, there were babies on that boat, and they were dropped in sea and they were eaten by the fish. And when the guards, coastal guards, identified some bodies, including, you know, what people have been saying, like may have been the body of this newborn, they said it's an animal eaten by other animals or something like, I mean, outrageous things. If we are in a situation where we cannot respect the integrity of people's bodies, including the integrity of people who drown in the sea in search for better lives, then how can we talk about any rights? How can we talk about any democratic rights? Why should we even talk about institutions and institutions of rule if we're not linking all these things to this everydayness that is lived by people, that, by the way, ends up structuring the way they think about their governments, the way they think about justice, the way they think about democracy. So without social and democratic rights that preserves people's dignity and bodily integrity, that, you know, gives them burials that are, you know, human burials, the representative democracy is not really democratic, right? So I want to conclude here by way of a journalistic account of Qais Said's July 25 so-called coup. So on July 27, just 2 days after that event, Stephen Cook, who's a journalist who covers the region pretty frequently, wrote in Foreign Policy an article about how, quote, the West misunderstood Tunisia. And suggested that maybe Tunisians never wanted democracy. This was the original title of this article in Foreign Policy 2 days after the coup. He changed the title later because I think he got a big pushback. And so the title of the article became How the West Misunderstood Tunisia, where he suggested that no, he does not mean that, quote, the canard that Arab and Muslim societies are unpracticed at democracy, end quote, but rather that there's a cultural legacy of Arab regimes, the one that promised education and healthcare and security, but never really delivered on these things that affects how people today think about democracy. So what I want to draw to your we can, you know, nitpick a little bit on his, or a lot on his use of culture and cultural, but okay, I'll leave that conversation among, I don't know, anthropologists and people who are interested in culture or something. We'll do that some other time. But what I want to draw your attention to is his conclusion, and I'm gonna quote him here. So many Tunisians seem to want a more effective state that can deliver jobs and a social safety net, and please pay attention to this, regardless of the character of the political system. It's possible that after a decade in which Tunisians enjoyed greater personal freedoms, the lack of prosperity has made the potentially significant number of them more willing to give some version of authoritarianism another try, end quote. So what is he suggesting here? That the choice is between one's personal freedom and one's ability to feed themselves? Does this choice present itself to any country that is not a developing country? Does this choice present itself in the US today, or in Belgium, where I currently live, or anywhere in Europe? I mean, how is this even a proposition that we can put on the table? Well, you know, they tried having freedoms, but because they had freedoms and nothing to eat, they decided they don't need freedom so that they can eat. This is an unacceptable proposition. It's an unacceptable thing to say. So we arrived at the state of affairs because there was something that had to change and did not change, right? And here I'm going to open it up for debate, that the question is one of domination and imperialism, that it's important to have human rights and freedoms, but without thinking the extractive economies and polities that link North to South relationships, going back to Ibrahima's point, that have neo-colonial and colonial roots, people will keep risking their lives crossing the Mediterranean that will swallow most of them. So maybe Tunisians need to think about a decolonization, and all of us need to think about a decolonization as a precursor and a condition of possibility for democratization. And until that is done, we are going to keep going in circles and keep asking the wrong questions, never the right questions about the region and what's going on in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lana. Let me return it back. Let me open up the conversation to all the panelists. We have two questions on chat, on the Q&A function, which panelists, you can access them, you can read them directly as well. Let me start with the first one, who is Phyllis Taua, who's asking more or less if citizen-led protests and engaged cultural actors have a role to play in promoting a culture of democracy in Africa. And let me also throw in one question here with regards to most of the discussion focused on structures today. And I'm wondering if the agency of political actors or of citizens has a role to play in democratization. Let's do 1 minute to 2 minutes each, if possible, so that we can return to more questions. And let me open up the floor. You can also, Ibrahima and Samir, if you could unmute yourselves for this part of the discussion.
Abder, I can start with this question of agency, because this links specifically to what I was saying. I mean, of course, I don't want to, I don't know, maybe my talk maybe portrayed people in the region as lacking agency, that is, and dying and whatever, and suffering from things they cannot control. But I want to make clear that that is not true, right? They work every day for better institutions, and they do it, again, in everyday practice, but also in their engagement with bureaucracies, in protest movements, in a different discourse about the state and how to conceive of the state. So I don't want to disregard this idea of agency, but these micro foundations need to connect somewhere to broader things. And if the micro foundations keep getting bogged down by structural things that are broader than them, we keep the micro foundations invisible. We keep these micro interactions invisible and focus on those big things, like the coup, the whatever, the big structure, the parliament that's dissolved, the armed group that did I don't know what kidnapping. So there is agency, but agency alone on the micro level without some kind of feedback mechanism to broader institutional structure is also a romanticization of what people can do. I mean, these are really these are real structures. And as Ibrahima, again, I'm going to go back to what he said. That Ibrahima said, you can organize as much as you want, but if a former colonial power decides to send the army to quell you, bad luck. You're in bad luck. Nothing you can do, even if you have a lot of agency.
Samir, let me hand over this question to you, because Ibrahima, there's another question directed directly to you. And because of that, let me give Samir a chance to respond to this question. And also, Samir, if you could take this opportunity to talk about structures, international structures and regional structures, and whether they matter in your analysis.
Well, thank you so much. And I would like to state my agreement with Lana on the importance of structural factors. Of course, I'll come to the role of agency later on, but I would like to really emphasize the importance of this. And I'm emphasizing on structural factors for specifically two reasons. One is that when we usually try to explain the persistence of autocracy, we talk about the role of elites. And that kind of blinds us from deeper economic, security and political dynamics, and the role of history as well, as both presenters were noting. in undercutting the possibility of democratic transition in country X, in my case, for example, in Ethiopia. And that leads to a very important policy implication, right? So if we are abstracting the role of structures, then we end up recommending easy solutions to very complex problems. So if it is just a matter of asking people to organize themselves to resist state, if it's just a matter of educating people how good democracy is, and then you'd get democratization, that kind of very simplistic way of conceptualizing your recommendations, your solutions to a very complex problem would actually end up in bringing about very detrimental consequences, because you will very much count on those very simplistic solutions, garner international support on that basis, try to get funds, for example, for this kind of recommendations, and you will end up, in fact, abetting autocratic rule. So autocracy, in the post-Cold War period, has really advanced. Right? So there are countries with a facade of democratic institutions and constitutions and so on and so forth, but are autocratic to the core. So we have to speak to all these very interlinking, very deep structural forces to really understand the phenomenon, and to come up with recommendations that really understand and appreciate the complexity of them. This does not mean that agency is totally thrown away. If we conceptualize democratization as a process and not as an event, then we would very well understand that, for example, protest movements would, in the long run, contribute towards building a culture of independence in people, a culture of agency, a culture of individual and collective autonomy. That in and of itself is a very important contribution in the process towards democratization. But as long as this huge power asymmetry exists between state forces and social agents, the possibility of getting a consolidated democracy in the short run as a result of protest movements is very, very dim. And that's what I think we can learn from the Ethiopian experience, and also from many Arab Spring countries along the Gulf region as well. So we have to understand those dynamics in mind. So coming back to your question, Abada, yes, structural forces are not really limited to domestic local factors. There are structural factors that are global in nature, that are regional in nature as well. One very important example in the literature as well as in Ethiopia is the role of global powers in sustaining and maintaining autocracy in this part. Right, so these global powers have inherent interests, very important calculations to make about political developments in the Horn of Africa. And as a result of that, they would see sometimes strong interests to support autocratic regimes that would contribute to authoritarian durability in the country. This was very, very important during the EPRDF's period between 1991 and 2018. And you would say the same thing when you talk about regional factors as well. The power imbalance among several countries in the Horn of Africa would really open gates and gateways actually for this, diversionary tactics by authoritarian regimes. They are playing more important roles in the region and on the continent, and therefore people have to focus on that rather than focusing on their rights and free and fair elections and so on and so forth. So all these structural forces do matter, but in my presentation, I just focus on one of those structural factors, which has a lot to do with historical, political, economic, and security, contexts at the domestic level.
Thank you, Samir. Let me hand it over to you, Ibrahima, and specifically regarding the question of what the position of the African Union is regarding, you did touch upon unconstitutional changes in government, but there's a more specific question in the Q&A function. And before I hand it over to Ibrahima, maybe so I don't forget, coming back to Lana, if we get a chance, if we get some time after Ibrahima, if you could circle back to what policy recommendations look like from your point of view. Is, for example, local democracy the solution? And with local democracy, are we talking about, can we talk about financial, fiscal, and budgetary democratization and decentralization? Is that where you are headed? Or do you stop at critique? But Ibrahima, let me hand it over to you regarding constitutional changes of government.
Yes, I've seen the question. You know, the concept of unconstitutional change of government has evolved since 1999. 1999, the unconstitutional change of government was just assimilated to military coup. But then African countries realized that apart from military coup, there are a number of situations that occurred on the continent, and I start by the situation that happened in Tunisia, for instance, in 2011, where a kind of uprising led to the change in government. You know, Ben Ali decided to leave the country and hand over the power to, you know, at the beginning it was to the military. And then after they found a kind of system that allow a sort of continuity, AU was obliged to really deal with that particular situation and to say publicly that the kind of uprising when it occurs in a country and lead to change of government cannot be assimilated to unconstitutional change of government. But now, as I mentioned to you, these attempts of third term can also be assimilated to unconstitutional change of government. What led to what Kais Saied did in the last 10 to 12 months can be also assimilated to unconstitutional change of government, because yes, he was using the constitution, but he was using the constitution of his own reading, but not the reading of the institution that was supposed to really deal with the issue, which is your constitutional court, but which didn't exist. So that also is a question. And if you see, the AU never, apart from one communique in the beginning of Kais Saied's decrees, never tried to look at the situation in Tunisia. It tells you about the difficulty for the AU itself to really designate or to really tell us what kind of system or what kind of process we're in. And the last element that I can tell you also about the AU and constitutional change of government is the difficulty for the AU itself to abide with its own principles and norms. Why I'm saying that is the situation in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood took over the power, ran the country for a few months. Al-Sisi, a military general, organized a coup. Egypt was suspended as normal. He decided to leave the army to be a candidate for the presidency, which is specifically mentioned in Article 25 of the Charter on Democracy, Election, and the paragraph 4, saying that even if there is a coup, those who conducted the coup cannot by any means participate in election. Al-Sisi did it, and Al-Sisi finally got the end of the suspension of Egypt through very interesting means. Algeria, who was a very powerful member of the AU, through a demand made by the US, because the US was on the of the view that Egypt cannot be isolated within Africa on African affairs, because Egypt played an important role between Africa and the Middle East. And Egypt played an important role in the American policy towards the two regions. So for that reason, and they were using Algeria because at that time, Algeria also needed the US in their international politics. And Algeria managed to convince some of the members of the Peace and Security Council in Africa to allow Egypt to come back. But that was a very important breach to the norms that we adopted within the continent about it. And that bad precedent can also lead to a number of situations in the future where a big country is involved in unconstitutional change of government. I'm thinking of countries like Nigeria, countries like South Africa, and to some extent countries like Algeria. You remember when there was this kind of uprising in Algeria during that period, nothing happened. No mention of Algeria within the AU. And that's also the reality of the continent. And I do believe that Africa is still trying to find its ways. But at the same time, the situation like in Tunisia, the attempt by different governments to have a third term are situations that the African countries need to make a decision on. Otherwise, that will continue because, you know, we are in the context where autocratism is a la mode, and everywhere on the continent, people are trying to use the different mechanisms to maintain themselves into power. If that is not done, it's the end of unconstitutional change of government.
Thank you, Ibrahima. Lana, let me hand it back to you, and I'll give you a minute or two and wrap up after that.
Yeah. I mean, are you kidding me? Of course, I would love only critique and no policy. I mean, of course. So yes, I'm a specialist in local urban politics. So of course, I'm gonna say that, you know, like effective decentralization is a solution, but it's not a panacea, right? So Qais Said also ran on a local, you know, kind of different reconceived decentralization platform. It only led to more populism, right? So it's not a panacea. The only way forward, I think, is, and it has to be like effective. It has to be not just, you know, not just like lip service. It has to be first financial decentralization, which is still extremely weak in Tunisia. You cannot give people, you cannot give governments, because what happens is that local governments are given tasks that they cannot fulfill because they do not have money to fulfill them. And then the state says, oh, we gave you the liberty of doing X, Y, and Z, and you didn't do anything. I mean, yeah, of course, because they didn't give them the money to do X, Y, and Z. And there's no local capacity of taxing because of very complicated histories of taxation, of direct taxation in the region and all the revolts around that, etc. But so it's not a panacea, right? The only reason why I actually support local governments and stuff like that, and the local, is because there's just much more room for experimentation, right? Instead of doing attempts at change at one level and like risking it all and putting all your eggs in one basket, you have, I don't know, in Tunisia, you have 365 municipalities. There are 365 different ways of trying, you know, something else, and seeing if it works or not, and organizing and putting forward claims and all that. So, but otherwise, I am better at critique than positive justice. Thanks.
Thank you, Lana.
Abadir, if you allow me one thing.
Okay.
I really think that there is one aspect that we didn't touch in this conversation, is the role of the intelligentsia, is the role of the academic, is the role of the universities, the role of those who can really think about the future of the continent. They are silent at the moment. It's not a surprise that you, based in the US, you are organizing this kind of meetings. In Africa, there is a silence. There is a silence of those who can think, and there is a silence of those who can really put us on the road, to help us to really. And I think this is one of the biggest problems that we are facing. The progress in democracy, the progress in rule of law is always based on conversation, based on dialogue, based on discussion within the society. If the society is unable to really think about its own future, how can that society can progress? This is one of the problems that we are having on our continent. And I do believe that the students that you have here, particularly those who are coming from Africa, that they can have that in their mind. When returning back on the continent, the first thing to be doing is also to create those spaces. We don't have spaces in our society. We don't have spaces in our country to organize this kind of conversation. It's about our own future. Nobody can decide on our own future as an African. And I think that's something that I really wanted to put forward, because it's the way, it's only through that process that we can really move the boundaries.
Thank you, Ibrahima. Let me finish with that note by saying that within the limited amount of time we had today, I hope we have answered some questions. We have started that dialogue, hopefully. And if we have answered some questions, good. If we have provoked critical questions, that's even better, I believe. And with this, let me thank the panelists and thank the participants for joining us today. I wish we will be able to continue this conversation in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.